Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something incredibly grim. Something that reveals the dark underbelly of historical expansion. We're diving into the brutal link between colonization and disease spread. Imagine a world where powerful empires reach across oceans. Not just with ships and soldiers, but with invisible killers that wipe out entire populations, inadvertently creating demographic catastrophes on a scale almost too vast to comprehend. This wasn't just about military might, it was about biology, and for millions. It was a death sentence delivered by the very act of contact. Honestly, if you were living in the path of these colonial ventures, you probably wouldn't survive the first wave of sickness, let alone the subsequent invasions. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the shores of a lush, vibrant Caribbean island in the late 15th century. The air is warm. The scent of exotic flowers hangs heavy, and indigenous communities thrive, their lives intricately woven with the rhythms of nature. Then, on the horizon, sails appear, Spanish caravels, bearing Christopher Columbus and his crew. Make landfall, they bring with them a new world of goods, ideas, and unbeknownst to them, a devastating array of unseen biological weapons. This is the beginning of the Columbian Exchange's deadly cargo, a profound and brutal transfer of diseases that would decimate indigenous populations across the Americas. Consider the biological asymmetry of this encounter. Europeans, having lived for centuries in dense, interconnected cities with domesticated animals, had developed some degree of immunity to a host of diseases: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and more. Their bodies, through generations of exposure, had learned to fight, or at least survive, these pathogens. Indigenous peoples of the Americas, however, had largely lived in isolation for millennia. Their societies lacked domesticated animals, the source of many old-world zoonotic diseases, and their populations, while sometimes dense, were not connected by the same vast, intricate trade networks as Eurasia and Africa. They were, in essence, a biologically virgin soil population, utterly defenseless against these alien microbes. It's like sending 1,000 people who've never seen fire into a burning building and expecting them to walk out unharmed. You observe the horrifying mechanism of spread. A European sailor, perhaps seemingly healthy but in the incubation period for smallpox, coughs on deck, or an early settler with a mild case of influenza interacts with a local trader. The virus, invisible and relentless, finds its way into the pristine, unimmunized indigenous population. There's no innate resistance, no protective antibodies, no collective memory of these diseases. The illness spreads like wildfire, often moving faster than the actual European explorers. Entire villages, tribes, and nations are struck down, not by steel and gunpowder, but by an unseen enemy that arrived on the very ships of the colonizers. The symptoms appear: fever, weakness, then the telltale rashes or coughs. Within days, communities are overwhelmed. Traditional healers, armed with spiritual knowledge and herbal remedies, are powerless against diseases they have never encountered, whose origins and mechanisms are utterly alien to their understanding. People are too sick to hunt, to farm, to care for their dying children, or even to bury their dead. The social fabric unravels under the immense pressure of widespread mortality and incomprehensible suffering. One particularly devastating detail is that the disease often preceded the direct arrival of the colonizers. A ship might arrive at one port, drop off a few infected individuals, and then sail on. But the disease, moving inland through indigenous trade routes, could wipe out communities before they ever saw a European face. This created a chilling advantage for colonizers, who sometimes encountered empty or vastly depopulated lands, unwittingly cleared by the biological vanguard of their invasion. Historians still debate the precise proportion of indigenous population decline, attributable directly to disease versus other colonial factors. But epidemiological studies widely confirm disease as the overwhelming primary cause of the initial demographic collapse across the Americas. The scale of the demographic catastrophe is almost unimaginable. Estimates vary, but some scholars suggest that 70% to 90% of the pre-Columbian indigenous population in the Americas died within the first century or two of European contact. This wasn't just a reduction in numbers, it was the obliteration of entire cultures, languages, and ways of life. The very act of European expansion, driven by exploration and conquest, inadvertently became the greatest biological exchange in human history, resulting in a silent genocide on an unprecedented scale. You're now moving from the broad, devastating impact of the Columbian exchange and into the specific, terrifying narrative of smallpox, the unseen conquistador. While Cortés and Pizarro had steel and gunpowder, their most potent and destructive weapon, an invisible ally, was the variola virus, smallpox, unknowingly introduced by European colonizers. Didn't just decimate indigenous populations, it often cleared the path for conquest, dramatically reshaping the balance of power. Imagine yourself in the heart of the Aztec Empire, a magnificent civilization teeming with millions of people in the early 16th century. Life is vibrant, complex, and deeply spiritual. Then, a few years after Cortés's initial landing on the coast, a new sickness begins to sweep through the land. It arrives with a horrifying speed that military expeditions could only dream of. A high fever, debilitating aches, and then the distinctive, agonizing rash of pustules that erupt over the entire body, turning faces into grotesque, swollen landscapes. This isn't just an illness, it's a biological apocalypse. Consider the utter defenselessness of the indigenous population. Having lived in biological isolation for millennia, they had no prior exposure to smallpox. Their immune systems had never encountered the variola virus, leaving them with absolutely no acquired immunity or genetic resistance. When the virus landed, it found a vast, virgin soil population, ripe for exploitation. One infected individual, perhaps a servant of Cortés's expedition or a local trader who came into contact with an infected Spaniard, could trigger an exponential chain of transmission. It's like throwing a single match into a forest that has never known fire. The blaze is immediate and catastrophic. You observe the horrifying consequences in densely populated areas like Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. The disease spread through the crowded city like wildfire, killing thousands, then tens of thousands. People were too sick to care for their dying, too weak to bury their dead. The sophisticated social and political structures of the empire began to unravel under the immense pressure of widespread death and unimaginable suffering. Leaders, warriors, priests, farmers, no one was spared. The very infrastructure of the civilization collapsed as the workforce perished. One particularly devastating detail is how smallpox often acted as a biological vanguard for European conquest. In the case of the Aztecs, smallpox broke out in Tenochtitlan just before Cortés launched his final assault. It killed the Aztec Emperor Cuitlahuac, among countless others, and incapacitated a significant portion of the fighting force. Imagine an army attempting to defend its homeland when half its soldiers are too sick to stand, their bodies ravaged by fever and pustules. The Spanish, though vastly outnumbered, found themselves facing a weakened, demoralized, and biologically devastated enemy. This wasn't a fair fight, it was a conquest aided by an invisible, deadly ally. Historians still debate the specific percentage of the Aztec population, wiped out by smallpox before the Spanish conquest versus other factors. But its overwhelming and undeniable role in the collapse is widely accepted. You notice the similar pattern in the Inca Empire. Francisco Pizarro's arrival in South America also coincided with a devastating smallpox epidemic that swept through the Inca lands. Even before Pizarro's forces reached the heartland, this epidemic killed the reigning Inca emperor, Huayna Capac, and his chosen heir, sparking a brutal civil war between his surviving sons, Atahualpa and Huáscar. When Pizarro eventually arrived, he found an empire already weakened, divided by civil strife, and reeling from the demographic catastrophe of smallpox. The internal chaos, directly fueled by the disease, made the Incas far more vulnerable to a relatively small European force. The legacy of smallpox as the unseen conquistador is profound. It demonstrates how biological factors, often far more potent than military technology, played a critical role in the outcomes of colonial encounters. The disease, unintentionally carried by colonizers, created a demographic vacuum that facilitated European dominance and forever altered the course of indigenous history across the Americas. The scars of smallpox were not just on the faces of survivors, but etched deep into the memory and very fabric of entire civilizations that simply vanished. You're now moving from the specific, devastating impact of smallpox and into a broader, yet equally brutal consequence of colonization: measles, flu, and viral waves. While smallpox often gets the most attention, other seemingly less deadly European diseases, when introduced to immunologically naive populations, became terrifying epidemics, sweeping through indigenous communities with horrifying efficiency and leaving a trail of death and profound societal disruption. Imagine yourself in a vibrant indigenous village in the American Northeast in the early 17th century, a community that has perhaps not yet had direct, prolonged contact with Europeans, but whose trade networks extend to coastal areas. The furs you trade, the baskets you weave, might inadvertently carry something far deadlier than any weapon the influenza virus or the measles virus. These diseases, mere nuisances or childhood rites of passage in Europe, become agents of mass death in a population with no prior exposure or genetic resistance. It's like being hit by a common cold, but that cold suddenly attacks your vital organs with the ferocity of the plague. Consider the swiftness and pervasiveness of these viral waves. Measles, for instance, a highly contagious airborne virus, would spread through entire villages in a matter of days. You see the telltale rash, the high fever, the severe cough. While in Europe, most children survived measles in the Americas. It often led to severe complications like pneumonia, rapidly escalating to death. Influenza, too, would cause high fevers, body aches, and respiratory distress, quickly debilitating entire communities. Imagine an entire village succumbing simultaneously. No one is well enough to hunt, to gather food, to tend to the sick, or even to fetch water. The collective incapacity leads to death not just from the disease itself, but from starvation and neglect. You observe the profound and rapid societal breakdown. If the adults are too sick to work, the children starve. If the elders, repositories of vital knowledge and oral tradition, die en masse, generations of accumulated wisdom vanish overnight. Funerals become impossible, rituals are abandoned, and the very fabric of communal life unravels. The spiritual world, once a source of comfort and guidance, seems to offer no explanation for this invisible scourge that picks off the strong and the weak alike. This wasn't just a loss of life, it was an erosion of cultural memory and social cohesion. One particularly cruel aspect was the cyclical nature of these waves. It wasn't just one disease, it was wave after wave of different pathogens. A community might just be recovering from a devastating influenza outbreak, with survivors still weakened and mourning. When measles or whooping cough would arrive on the next wave of contact, This relentless succession of epidemics prevented any true recovery or demographic rebound, constantly pushing populations to the brink of extinction. Historians still debate the precise sequence and interplay of various Old World diseases in decimating specific indigenous populations. But the cumulative effect of these repeated viral waves is a central and tragic feature of colonial encounters. The lack of effective remedies further exacerbated the misery. Traditional healers, while skilled in treating local ailments, had no conceptual framework or practical treatments for these alien viruses. Their herbal medicines, effective for familiar conditions, proved useless against these unseen invaders. This powerlessness of traditional medicine in the face of imported disease further undermined the spiritual and social foundations of indigenous societies. You notice how these diseases, often less immediately fatal for Europeans, still played a profound role in their own experience of colonization. European explorers and early settlers themselves suffered from these same diseases, albeit with lower mortality rates due to their partial immunity. They often had their own outbreaks on ships and in early settlements, showing that even the colonizers were not immune to the biological chaos they unleashed. However, their ability to survive and replenish their numbers ultimately allowed them to persist and expand. While indigenous populations were simply overwhelmed, you're now moving from the disfiguring scourge of smallpox and into a more widespread, gut-wrenching terror that constantly threatened the lives of slum dwellers. Dysentery's gutter-borne agony. This wasn't just an unpleasant illness, it was a devastating, dehydrating plague of the digestive system, thriving in the very sewage-filled streets and contaminated food supplies that defined industrial urban life. Imagine yourself in a narrow, cobbled alleyway of a 19th century slum, perhaps in overcrowded Dublin or the back streets of Glasgow. The air is foul, thick with the smell of stagnant water and human waste. Open sewers run down the center of the street, carrying filth from countless tenements. Children play near these gutters, and in their desperate hunger, people might pick up discarded food. This horrifying environment is the perfect conduit for dysentery, an intestinal infection caused by various bacteria like Shigella or amoebas, spread by contaminated food, water, or direct contact with feces. It's like living in a giant, open-air toilet, and every breath you take, every morsel you eat, is a gamble with your life. Consider the agonizing symptoms. It begins with sudden, severe diarrhea, often mixed with blood and mucus. This is accompanied by intense abdominal pain, cramping so severe it doubles you over, and a constant, agonizing urge to defecate, even when your bowels are empty. Fever, nausea, and vomiting quickly follow. The body rapidly loses fluids, leading to extreme dehydration, weakness, and, for many, a swift, brutal death. Imagine the constant, wrenching pain, the endless trips to a communal, unsanitary privy if one exists, or simply succumbing in your own bed. Your body racked by an unstoppable internal war. You observe the horrifying speed of its spread, particularly among children, infants and young children, with their weaker immune systems and closer contact with contaminated environments playing on the filthy streets. Crawling on dirty floors were particularly vulnerable. Dysentery was a leading cause of infant mortality in these slums, wiping out entire families of young children within days. Imagine the desperate cries of a dehydrating child, their tiny body wasting away, with no access to clean water or medical care that could truly save them. The sheer volume of infant deaths from dysentery contributed immensely to the pervasive despair in these communities. One particularly cruel irony was the lack of clean water and proper sanitation. While cities were growing rapidly, the infrastructure for waste removal and clean water supply lagged far behind. Public water pumps were often located perilously close to overflowing cesspits or leaky sewers, allowing contamination to seep into the drinking supply. People often had no choice but to drink this tainted water, leading to a constant cycle of infection and reinfection. The very basic necessity of life-clean water became a primary vector for death. Historians still debate the specific causal links between various slum conditions and dysentery outbreaks versus other diseases. But the role of contaminated water and poor sanitation is universally accepted as a primary driver. The spread was relentless. A single family's illness could rapidly contaminate an entire tenement. Shared privies, communal water sources, and the close proximity of residents meant that once dysentery entered a building, it would likely sweep through every room. The sheer exhaustion of constant illness, combined with malnutrition, weakened the immune systems of the survivors, making them more susceptible to other diseases. It was a relentless grinding down of the population, a silent but deadly war of attrition, you notice the profound helplessness. Doctors, if available, could offer little more than symptomatic relief. The true solution, massive investments in clean water infrastructure and sewerage systems, was beyond the grasp of the impoverished residents, and often beyond the political will of the authorities until much later. For generations, dysentery remained a terrifying, inescapable reality of life in the industrial slums, a constant reminder of the horrific cost of unchecked urban growth and neglected public health. You're now moving from the swift, waterborne terror of cholera and into a more insidious, airborne, and blood-borne threat carried by ships' yellow fever's mosquito-borne manifests. This wasn't a disease that traveled on human hosts or in their provisions, but via a tiny winged assassin that ships unknowingly transported to new, vulnerable lands, sparking devastating epidemics in port cities. Imagine yourself on a merchant ship sailing from West Africa or the Caribbean in the late 18th or early 19th century, heading towards a bustling port in the Americas or Europe. The ship is hot, often humid, and below deck. Stagnant water might collect in barrels, bilges, or discarded containers, unknown to the crew and passengers. These small pockets of water are breeding grounds for a silent killer, Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. These particular mosquitoes are the primary vectors for the yellow fever virus. One infected mosquito, perhaps having bitten an infected sailor in a previous port, could lay eggs that hatch during the voyage, turning the ship into a flying, buzzing incubator of disease. It's like a tiny winged assassin squad hidden in the dark corners of the ship, waiting for their next target. Consider the journey. As the ship makes its way across the ocean, the infected mosquitoes, or newly hatched ones, begin to feed. They bite sailors and passengers, silently transmitting the virus. The symptoms, when they appear, are terrifying sudden fever, chills, severe headaches, and muscle aches. Then comes the more ominous phase, jaundice, turning the skin and eyes yellow, hence yellow fever, internal bleeding, and severe vomiting, often of black, partially digested blood. Death can follow rapidly. Within a week, the ship, once a means of commerce, becomes a death trap, its decks witnessing agonizing suffering and horrifyingly yellowed corpses. You observe the frustration of port authorities. A ship arrives, seemingly healthy, or perhaps with a few cases of fever that are not immediately identified as yellow fever. The sick are taken ashore, and the mosquitoes, often carried inadvertently in water barrels, cargo, or simply flying off the ship, quickly establish themselves in the warm, humid port environment within days or weeks. A full-blown epidemic explodes in the city, baffling local physicians who often blamed miasma or imported goods. Rather than the tiny insect vector that arrived by sea, the ship, an unwitting accomplice, sailed away, leaving a trail of death in its wake. One particularly cruel irony of yellow fever's spread was its preference for densely populated, unsanitary port cities. These urban environments, with their warm climates, abundant standing water, and large, susceptible populations, were perfect breeding grounds for Aedes aegypti, A single infected ship could spark an epidemic that decimated entire cities, overwhelming their nascent public health systems. Historians still debate the precise mechanisms of Aedes aegypti survival on long sea voyages, but the consistent pattern of yellow fever outbreaks following ship arrivals in vulnerable ports is a well-established fact. The lack of understanding about mosquito transmission meant that early preventative measures were often ineffective. People would try to fumigate ships with sulfur or burn aromatic herbs, believing they were purifying the air, while the real culprits, the mosquitoes, continued to breed in hidden water sources, quarantines, while potentially limiting human-to-human spread on land, did little to stop the winged vectors once they had escaped the ship and established themselves ashore. It's like trying to put out a forest fire by spraying water on the trees. While the arsonist is still running around with a flamethrower, you notice the profound economic and social impact. Port cities, vital for trade, would be devastated, their commerce halted, their populations fleeing in terror. The fear of yellow fever led to strict maritime regulations, often unfairly targeting ships from specific regions, exacerbating tensions and disrupting global trade. The unseen, tiny mosquito, ferried by humanity's own vessels, became a silent architect of economic ruin and social collapse in coastal areas. The development of mosquito nets, drainage projects, and eventually vaccines, centuries later, were direct responses to understanding the specific transmission pathway. But for generations, ships unknowingly served as vectors for this devastating disease, turning vibrant port cities into places of yellowed faces and mass graves. All thanks to a tiny insect that loved a good sea voyage. You're now moving from the mosquito-borne menace of yellow fever and into a chapter of maritime disease that shaped the course of modern history. Influenza's global naval net, the First World War, with its unprecedented movement of troops and crowded transport ships, inadvertently created the perfect incubator and expressway for the deadliest pandemic in recent memory, the 1918 Spanish flu. Imagine yourself on a crowded troop transport ship, a repurposed ocean liner, crossing the Atlantic in the spring of 1918. You are one of thousands of young soldiers, packed into every available space below deck. The air is stale and thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and the underlying anxiety of war. Unknown to you and to the medical officers on board, a new, highly virulent strain of influenza virus is quietly making its way through the ranks. One cough, one sneeze, one shared mess kit in these cramped quarters, and the virus finds its perfect storm. It's like you're in a giant, floating petri dish, and the culture is about to explode. Consider the ideal conditions for viral spread. Thousands of susceptible young men, often already weakened by training, stress, and poor nutrition, are living in extremely close proximity. Ventilation is minimal, and hygiene is challenging. The virus, a master of airborne transmission, leaps from soldier to soldier with frightening speed. You see the initial symptoms: a sudden, severe fever, body ache so intense they feel like your bones are breaking, extreme fatigue, and a cough that racks your entire body. Unlike typical flu, this strain often caused severe pneumonia, filling the lungs with fluid, leading to a terrifying, rapid death. The ship, designed to transport healthy fighting men, transforms into a floating hospital, then a floating morgue. You observe the grim progression. What starts as a few isolated cases quickly escalates into a full-blown outbreak, overwhelming the ship's limited medical staff and supplies, doctors and nurses, themselves falling ill, are helpless against the sheer volume of sick and dying. Bodies are wrapped in canvas and slipped into the ocean, a chilling necessity of wartime at sea. The constant fear of infection, the sounds of racking coughs and delirious moans, and the sight of comrades succumbing to an unseen enemy create an atmosphere of profound despair. It's truly a grim form of combat, where the enemy is within your own ranks, invisible and relentless. One particularly cruel irony of this era was that the very act of mobilizing for war inadvertently facilitated the global spread of the influenza. Troop ships, sailing constantly between continents, became super spreaders, taking the virus from its likely origins perhaps in the US, Europe, or even China. Historians still debate the initial geographical spread and dropping it off in ports worldwide. A ship arriving in a French port from the American Midwest could quickly introduce the virus to a new population, which then spread it rapidly through civilian communities and other military units. Historians still debate the specific viral mutations that made the 1918 flu so deadly, but its rapid global dissemination was undeniably linked to wartime troop movements and crowded transport ships. The lack of understanding about viruses also meant that containment efforts were rudimentary, while some attempts might be made to isolate the sick. The highly contagious nature of influenza meant it was often too late. Masks, if used, were often simple cloth barriers that offered limited protection. The primary focus was on the war effort, and the influenza, while devastating, was often downplayed or censored by wartime governments to maintain morale. This meant the hidden killer was allowed to spread unchecked. You notice the sheer scale of the human toll. The 1918 influenza pandemic infected an estimated 1/3 of the world's population and killed at least 50 million people globally, far more than the war itself, and a significant portion of that initial spread, that rapid global reach, began in the cramped, unsanitary, and utterly vulnerable confines of troop transport ships. These vessels, designed for the movement of armies, became silent architects of a global catastrophe that eclipsed the very conflict they served. You're now moving from the human-made vectors of troop ships and into a more subtle, yet equally debilitating, maritime affliction scurvy's lingering lessons, while not caused by a pathogen. This nutritional deficiency, rampant on long voyages, tragically weakened sailors' immune systems, turning overcrowded ships into even deadlier incubators for infectious diseases. It's a silent, insidious killer that made every other terrible outbreak even worse. Imagine yourself on a long-haul sailing ship in the 16th century, perhaps circumnavigating the globe with Magellan, or searching for new trade routes to the Indies. Weeks stretch into months, then years. At sea, your diet is monotonous and grim. Hardtack, a brick-like biscuit, salted meat, and stale water. There are no fresh fruits or vegetables. You, along with your shipmates, begin to develop strange symptoms. First, a pervasive fatigue, then your gums swell and bleed, your teeth loosen, and old wounds stubbornly refuse to heal. This is scurvy, a disease caused by a severe lack of vitamin C. It's not a virus or bacteria, but a fundamental breakdown of your body's ability to repair itself. It's like trying to build a house without cement. Everything just slowly starts to fall apart. Consider the horrifying progression of the disease. Your skin breaks out in dark, purplish spots. Your limbs swell painfully. Eventually, you become too weak to even stand, succumbing to internal hemorrhages or gangrene. The suffering is prolonged and agonizing, a slow, debilitating decline that transforms robust sailors into pathetic shadows of their former selves. The ship, already a confined space, becomes a floating hospice for the gravely ill. Their groans and moans a constant backdrop to the creaking of the timbers. You observe the crucial, yet often overlooked, link between scurvy and infectious diseases. A body ravaged by scurvy is a body with a severely compromised immune system. What might be a mild cold for a healthy individual becomes a deadly pneumonia for someone with scurvy. A minor cut that would normally heal quickly turns into a festering, gangrenous wound. This meant that if an infectious disease, like typhus or dysentery, also broke out on a ship, Its impact was exponentially worse on a scurvy-ridden crew. Scurvy didn't directly cause epidemics, but it acted as a terrifying amplifier of existing outbreaks, turning a bad situation into a catastrophe. One particularly cruel irony was the sheer ignorance surrounding its cause and cure for centuries. For a long time, scurvy was attributed to everything from bad air and idleness to salty food or homesickness. Cures were often bizarre and ineffective, involving concoctions of strange herbs or even bloodletting. The simple solution, fresh citrus fruits, was discovered and then forgotten multiple times throughout history. This lack of knowledge meant that countless lives were lost needlessly, their suffering compounded by a disease that could have been easily prevented. Historians still debate why the knowledge of citrus as a scurvy cure was so frequently lost and rediscovered across different maritime eras. But this recurring amnesia led to immense suffering. You notice the profound impact on exploration and naval power? Scurvy decimated crews, sometimes killing more sailors than battles. Entire expeditions were crippled, their goals abandoned. Because too many men were too sick to sail, nations struggled to maintain their navies and merchant fleets. As the health of their sailors was constantly undermined by this insidious deficiency, it was a silent, biological war that often had more impact on global power dynamics than cannons and cutlasses. The discovery and widespread implementation of vitamin C supplementation, primarily through citrus fruits in the 18th and 19th centuries, marked a monumental turning point. Figures like James Lind, a British naval surgeon, conducted pioneering clinical trials that definitively linked citrus to scurvy prevention. Imagine the relief as sailors, once condemned to months of agonizing suffering, suddenly had a simple, effective preventative measure. The lingering lessons of scurvy taught humanity the vital connection between nutrition and immunity, a knowledge hard-won through centuries of unimaginable suffering at sea. You're now moving from the debilitating effects of scurvy and into the darkest, most horrifying chapter of maritime history: the slave ship's unimaginable hell. These vessels, designed for the forced transport of human beings, were not merely crowded or unsanitary by accident. Their conditions were intentionally brutal, systematically creating breeding grounds for multiple deadly diseases. Turning the Middle Passage into a literal death voyage for millions, imagine yourself chained in the suffocating darkness of a slave ship's hold, packed so tightly with hundreds of other human beings that you can barely breathe. The air is thick with the stench of fear, vomit, feces, and sweat. There's no ventilation, no sanitation, and no escape. This isn't just overcrowding, it's a deliberate act of dehumanization, a calculated strategy to maximize human cargo space with utterly no regard for human life. The conditions aren't just conducive to disease, they are designed to guarantee its horrific spread. Consider the multitude of diseases that thrived in this environment. Dysentery, often called the flux, was rampant, causing agonizing, bloody diarrhea that rapidly dehydrated its victims. Smallpox, sometimes intentionally brought aboard to weed out the unfit, swept through the holds with terrifying speed among populations with no immunity. Measles, influenza, and various fevers also ran rampant, each finding fertile ground in weakened bodies and unbreathing spaces. It's like a macabre lottery, where every disease has a ticket, and you're forced to play. You observe the horrifying realities of the daily routine. The sick and the healthy are indistinguishable in the dark. Packed holds, waste accumulates in the shackles, creating a filthy, contaminated environment that no amount of rudimentary cleaning could meaningfully address. The dying are left amongst the living, their cries and groans a constant reminder of shared misery. Bodies, once lifeless, are often thrown overboard, sometimes still chained, to be devoured by sharks that followed the ships, creating a grim escort across the ocean. The sheer scale of suffering is beyond comprehension. One particularly cruel aspect was the deliberate cruelty and neglect. Food and water were rationed to bare subsistence levels, often contaminated or spoiled. Medical care was virtually non-existent, administered by untrained crew members whose primary concern was the cargo's survival as a commodity, not as human beings. Sick individuals might be separated, not out of compassion, but to prevent widespread loss of product. This systemic brutality created a physical and psychological environment that actively cultivated disease. Historians still debate the precise number of enslaved people who died during the Middle Passage, with estimates ranging from 1.5 million to over 2 million. But disease was undeniably the largest single cause of death. The mental torment was as brutal as the physical. The despair of capture, the terror of the unknown, the constant sounds of suffering, the knowledge that your fellow human beings were dying around you, all contributed to a profound sense of hopelessness. Many simply lost the will to live, succumbing to what was known as fixed melancholy, a form of severe depression that hastened death. You notice how the concept of seasoning evolved from these horrors. Upon arrival in the Americas, surviving enslaved people were often subjected to a period of seasoning, an intentional process of breaking their spirits and preparing them for labor, but also a time when they were still highly susceptible to local diseases. This was another phase of high mortality. Continuing the grim toll of the Middle Passage on new land, the ships were just the first, terrifying chapter in a lifelong sentence of suffering. The economic drivers behind this unimaginable suffering are sickening. The desire for profit, for cheap labor, created a system where human lives were utterly devalued. The ship owners and traders, far removed from the stench and agony of the holds, saw only numbers and potential gains, justifying the horrors with dehumanizing rhetoric. The slave ship was not just a vessel, it was a floating factory of misery, designed to break human beings and deliver a horrific harvest. You're now moving from the unimaginable horrors of the slave ship and into a more contemporary, yet equally relevant chapter. Modern cruise ships contained crises, even in an age of advanced medical science, sophisticated sanitation systems, and global connectivity. These floating resorts, designed for luxury and leisure, can still transform into incubators of disease, demonstrating that the fundamental challenges of overcrowded vessels remain, albeit with different pathogens and more visible scientific responses. Imagine yourself on a modern cruise ship, a colossal vessel teeming with thousands of passengers from every corner of the globe. You're enjoying the buffet, lounging by the pool, perhaps attending a live show. The air conditioning hums, the water is filtered, and the amenities are endless. But then, a subtle whisper starts. A few people develop a cough. Then some report stomach issues suddenly. The ubiquitous hand sanitizer stations become more than just a courtesy. They become a grim necessity. The luxurious floating city, designed for escapism, is quietly becoming a contained crisis. Consider the ideal conditions for rapid viral spread. Despite modern ventilation and cleaning protocols, a cruise ship is still a confined, densely populated environment. Passengers share common dining areas, entertainment venues, and often small, recirculated cabin air. If a highly contagious virus, like norovirus, often called the cruise ship flu, and influenza, or even newer respiratory pathogens, gets on board, it can spread with alarming speed through thousands of susceptible hosts. It's like putting 1,000 people in a giant sealed box with a highly contagious cold. What do you expect to happen? You observe the rapid escalation of a typical outbreak. What starts as a handful of isolated cases can quickly overwhelm the ship's medical facilities, which, while modern, are not designed for a full-scale epidemic. Crew members, themselves susceptible, are stretched thin, forced to take on additional roles in sanitization and patient care. Passengers, confined to their cabins, experience the chilling reality of isolation, their vacation dreams turning into a nightmare of fear and boredom. The ship's public areas, once vibrant, become eerily quiet. Testament to the unseen enemy spreading below deck, one particularly frustrating aspect is the challenge of containment, even with advanced diagnostics. Identifying and isolating every infected individual on a crowded ship is incredibly difficult. People might be asymptomatic, or their symptoms might be mild, leading to continued transmission before they are identified. The highly trafficked common areas, the shared buffets, and the constant flow of people make it almost impossible to stop a determined virus. Epidemiologists still debate the optimal strategies for preventing and containing outbreaks on cruise ships versus the inherent risks of such environments. But the challenges are widely acknowledged. The psychological toll on passengers and crew is immense. Passengers, having paid for a relaxing vacation, find themselves trapped, potentially exposed, and completely at the mercy of the ship's protocols and the virus's whims. Crew members, living and working in even tighter quarters, face constant exposure, long hours, and the pressure of dealing with anxious or angry passengers, often far from their homes and families. It's a unique form of modern maritime misery, where luxury meets unforeseen peril. You notice the economic consequences. A single outbreak can lead to massive financial losses for cruise lines, with canceled voyages, legal battles, and severe reputational damage. Port cities, fearing the introduction of disease, might deny entry to affected ships, leaving them stranded at sea, a modern echo of the quarantines of old. The entire global industry, once a symbol of carefree travel, becomes vulnerable to the unseen threats that can turn a dream vacation into a terrifying ordeal, even with all our scientific knowledge. These contained crises on cruise ships serve as a stark reminder that humanity's fundamental vulnerability to infectious disease persists. Crowded conditions, even with air conditioning and gourmet food, still create pathways for pathogens. The lessons learned from the galleons of the Black Death and the typhus-ridden immigrant ships continue to hold true whenever large groups of people are confined together. The risk of a terrible outbreak looms. You're now at the final step of our journey through terrible outbreaks that started on crowded ships. Reflecting on quarantine's cruel necessity, from the rudimentary quarantines of medieval Venice to the complex protocols of modern cruise ships, the fear of shipborne disease has consistently driven humanity to implement brutal, yet often effective, measures to protect its shores. It's a stark reminder that even in desperate times, collective survival often demands profound sacrifices of individual liberty. Imagine yourself a merchant in 14th century Venice, standing on the docks, looking out at a ship approaching from the east. It carries exotic goods, but also, potentially, the unseen horror of the Black Death. Before it can enter the bustling port, a grim pronouncement is made the ship, its crew, and its cargo must undergo 40 giorni, 40 days of isolation. This isn't a suggestion, it's an order enforced by armed guards. The ship must anchor far from shore, its passengers forbidden from disembarking, its cargo untouched. This was the birth of formal maritime quarantine, a desperate measure born from bitter experience and a rudimentary understanding that separation could stem the tide of death. Consider the immense economic cost and human suffering of these early quarantines. Imagine being a passenger, perhaps an immigrant hoping for a new life, trapped on board for weeks or months, staring at the distant, tantalizing shore. Food and water might dwindle. Disease might still rage in the cramped confines, and the uncertainty of ever being allowed ashore would be a constant torment. Merchants saw their valuable cargo rot, their profits vanish, all while their ships sat idle. Rotting, too. The economic livelihood of entire cities depended on trade, yet the very engine of that trade was intermittently brought to a grinding halt by these enforced isolations. It's like putting your entire economy on pause, hoping the invisible enemy just gets bored and leaves, you observe the brutality of enforcement. Port officials, often desperate to protect their communities, would resort to extreme measures. Ships attempting to break quarantine might be fired upon. Individuals trying to sneak ashore could face imprisonment, fines, or even execution. Imagine the desperate attempts of starving sailors or terrified passengers trying to slip past the vigilant patrols in the dead of night. Knowing the consequences if caught, the lines between public health and martial law blurred, transforming the coastline into a dangerous frontier against unseen pathogens. Historians still debate the precise effectiveness of rudimentary quarantine in completely halting plague transmission versus simply slowing its spread. But its role in mitigating devastation is widely acknowledged. The concept of health certificates and standardized inspections emerged from these practices. A ship arriving from a clean port might be granted quicker entry, provided it had a certificate verifying its health. This led to a nascent form of international health regulation, an early attempt to create a system of trust and control over maritime travel. However, these certificates were often fallible, subject to bribery, or simply useless against an invisible enemy that could be incubating for weeks. One particularly poignant aspect is the psychological toll on those enforcing quarantine. These guards, often sailors or soldiers, were themselves at risk. They had to balance their duty to the community with the desperate pleas of those confined, often knowing that the disease they were trying to contain was already inside the walls, or that their own families were suffering. It's a thankless, terrifying job, where every decision could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds, or thousands. You notice how quarantine became a symbol of fear and state power. The very sight of a quarantined ship, or the yellow flag flying from its mast, instilled dread. It was a visible reminder of humanity's vulnerability to disease and the extraordinary lengths to which governments would go to protect their populations, even if it meant sacrificing the individual freedoms and livelihoods of those trapped, even in modern times. During global pandemics, the ghost of maritime quarantine reappears. Cruise ships become floating symbols of containment, their passengers confined to cabins, their journeys halted by anxious port authorities. While medical understanding is vastly superior, the fundamental act of isolating infected or exposed populations on vessels remains a necessary, albeit still profoundly difficult and economically disruptive, tool in public health. The principles established in response to the Black Death still find their echoes in the 21st century, as the echoes of desperate quarantines and contained crises gently dissolve into the quietude of your room. Let your mind drift away from the vast, unforgiving oceans and the silent, spreading diseases. Feel the subtle tension in your thoughts ease, imagining the intricate dance of human endeavor and nature's raw power, now softening into a peaceful, indistinct blur. The journey through floating horrors and the hard-won lessons of isolation has reached its gentle conclusion, leaving you in the serene stillness of your own space. The flickering moments of fear and fortitude, of cramped confinement and boundless courage, are now fading into a tranquil calm. Let the soft hum of the fan, or the serene silence of your room, guide you deeper into profound relaxation. There's nothing left to fear, no treacherous voyage to endure, no invisible foe to face, just the peaceful rhythm of your own breath, easing you further and further into a restful slumber. Let the last remnants of our historical dive into maritime misery gently merge with the shadows of the night,